Um, Thanks so much, Sarah, and the team at the Tertiary Education Commission. Is my volume okay?
It's great, Minnie, thank you.
Awesome. Kia ora koutou, ko Minnie Baragwanath toko ingoa. It's an absolute privilege to be here with you all today. I'm coming to you from the beautiful town or city, I'm not quite sure of the definition of Wanganui. A beautiful sunny day here, and just so delighted to be connecting with you right across Aotearoa. And as Sarah said, my session today is about leading beyond accessibility. And I was so bold as to take the next step and sort of talk about leading a future of possibility. And as I move through my presentation, I'm hoping that framing, that language will become crystal clear, and why, for me, how we talk about this community and this work is so absolutely fundamental and critical. For me personally, I feel that tertiary education organisations play such a vital role in our community. And I know, well, probably all of you are under enormous pressure, possibly even unprecedented pressure at the moment from the current world that we're living in. And I think the real risk in a climate like this is that many of the hard fought for wins and gains can actually be lost, particularly when it comes to those communities that have been traditionally underserved. I think the risk is that even the progress we've made to date could actually be lost. So I just want to thank TEC for creating the space for this conversation today. And whilst I've asked that there is no chat through the chat function, just because it's terribly disabling. Well, it actually is terribly disabling because my screen reader speaks out loud, and so I end up hearing that. I very much encourage us to have questions, time for questions at the end of the session. So please do save up your questions or inquiries. And of course, I'm also happy if you want to reach out to me after today's session if we run out of time to have a more in-depth discussion. But as I said, for me, universities, tertiary education organisations are pivotal in terms of pioneers, I think, of thought leadership and pushing the boundaries of societal knowledge. And one of the things that I think universities and tertiary educations do so well, or can do so well, are to be the pioneers of worldviews, thinking about critical and different ways of looking at the world around us, exploring, unpacking, and encouraging critical thought and discussion, right through to practical application. So the praxis of theory through to practical application in the world around us. And as I share some of my personal story with you, I hope it sort of shines a bit of a light on some of the experiences I've had personally going through education at various levels, but then through to my current work and focus as someone who has a passion, as Sarah said, for innovative ways of thinking about accessibility that are fit for the 21st century. And fundamentally, I feel that we mostly operate in a very outmoded worldview. I think most of society is captured by a very outmoded way of thinking about accessibility and disability. And I think often we don't even realise that we're looking at the world around us through a particular worldview. So if nothing else, I hope by the end of this, you come away with a fresh set of eyes and a fresh way of looking at the world around us, and the people, our community, our citizens, our students, our colleagues who happen to live with an impairment. And so I will just be calling out slide each time I need a slide to change. So hopefully we'll get into a good rhythm. So on that basis, next slide. Hopefully this works as a system. Oh, perfect. So what I want to do is to start with a little bit about my own personal story. just to ground this conversation. And I guess also to share why, for me, accessibility and, dare I say it, possibility matters so deeply to me, and why I feel this is an area that needs to be focused on. So next slide, thanks. So my story begins in another town, not too far from Wanganui, Palmerston North. Woohoo! I don't know if anyone's there from Palmy today. That's where I was born and where I grew up, and had a fairly, I don't know, fairly average childhood, if there is such a thing. Actually, that's not true. I had quite an unusual childhood. But anyway, we'll come back to that. But by the time I was 14, I was at high school. And I was, well, actually, no, 13 even. I started high school, and I started to notice that I was having a lot of trouble seeing. I'd been diagnosed with a just quite normal short-sightedness when I was about 6 or 7 in primary school, and had glasses for when I was in the classroom. But other than that, I was playing sport, music, and I guess functioning, if you like, and leading a very full and rich life as a child. However, as I started high school, I started to notice that I was really struggling in the classroom. And it reached a point where I could no longer see what was on the blackboard. I was sitting right at the front of the classroom. I couldn't get any closer to the blackboard. I couldn't see, as were used a lot back in those days, overhead projectors with the glare and the light, and when images were put up on the screen. Gosh, I sound like a dinosaur, don't I, talking about all this? But anyway. And what's more, I was starting to really struggle to read my books. And I'd been brought up in a family that read a lot. My mother was and still is one of the most avid readers I have ever come across in my life. She plows through books. And so we'd all been brought up with a huge passion for reading and encouraged to read at every opportunity. But gradually I was struggling more and more. And I found I not only was struggling with accessing my books, but also I was starting to struggle with music. I couldn't see the music that I was learning, and gradually I was starting to struggle with the sports that I was playing. I was playing tennis, badminton, basketball, hockey, lots of things with very hard balls flying at me. And when you've been hit in the head a few times by a couple of enthusiastic hockey balls or a basketball, you start to think maybe something's a bit wrong. And this all came to a head for me when my father took me for my first driving lesson just before my 15th birthday. And we drove through a pedestrian crossing, which I just simply hadn't seen. And both of us realised in that moment that perhaps there was something quite seriously wrong with my eyesight, more than just your average short-sightedness. We then spent about a year with me going to see lots of different eye specialists and doctors, having all sorts of tests done. And ultimately, 3 potential verdicts came back. One was that perhaps I had a psychological disorder, and I just did not want to see the world around me. And that was attributed to the fact that my home life was a little bit chaotic and disruptive at that point. So I spent a lot of time reflecting on, did I just not want to see the world around me? The second option was that I had a brain tumour. And again, this could have been a very real possibility. But we soon discounted that. And ultimately, after many, many months of testing, wondering, of real uncertainty, and, as a 14-year-old, wondering if you had a psychological problem or had a brain tumour is quite significant. When I finally got my diagnosis, it was actually a relief. My diagnosis was that I had a congenital sight condition called Stargardt's. Stargardt's is, the actual name is known as, translates as stargazer, which is quite pretty. It means that wherever I look in the centre of my eyes, I see like a film of starry lights over everything. It's a bit like having a slice of the Milky Way popped in front of my eyesight. And whilst that can sound quite romantic when it comes to trying to look at a computer screen, when it comes to trying to look at the printed word, when it comes to trying to look at someone's face, drive a car, it's hugely problematic. So essentially, I'm blind in the centre of both my eyes. I have no vision in the centre. I have no central vision. If we were in a room together right now, you would all look like people out of, you know, how they used to pixelate people off those crime programs. Interestingly, now they don't seem to do that, do they? In fact, they seem to show us the people because they want us to identify them. But anyway, back in the day, they used to pixelate out people's faces. And that's actually a brilliant way of depicting how I tend to see the world around me. Nothing has clear definition, nothing has clear lines. Everything's blurry, fuzzy, and sparkly, actually. Everything constantly moves. So you can perhaps imagine that that was going to pose some real challenges for me going forward in my life generally, and specifically when it came to reading and learning. And the other thing to bear in mind is this was the mid-80s. So if we think back to where technology was, we were a long way back from where we are today, and the kinds of opportunities that technology now provides simply were not available back then. But one of the things that struck me very quickly on in my journey was that overnight I went from being Minnie, just an average student, if you like, in the classroom, to being Minnie, who was now labelled disabled and blind. And what was most alarming, if you like, was the attitudes of people. And I can say that the world broadly fell into two distinct categories. And I would argue those two categories are the two categories that still apply to this very day. So whilst technology has changed and the world around us has changed in many ways, I think, unfortunately, our attitude and our understanding of accessibility really has not moved very far at all. And what I noticed back then was that when my diagnosis became public knowledge through the school, my sports coaches, my music teachers, my teachers in the classroom, either focused on what I could not do, what I would call the deficit model, the disabling model, the approach where all people could focus on was my sight loss and the fact that I should now be removed from sport, music, education, and the deficit. The other side of it, thank goodness, was the positive, what I now call the possibility approach. Those teachers, those sports coaches, those music teachers who were motivated by curiosity, by learning, by asking the question, what is possible here, became my allies and my advocates. They were the ones that said, okay, Minnie, you can't perhaps read a book in the conventional way. You can't see the blackboard in a conventional way. What can we be doing as your teachers to support you as a learner to thrive in this environment? What can we be doing differently? And as I said, those two positions, if you like, those two worldviews are absolutely fundamental. And all throughout my life, and I would say probably the lives of many, if not most people with disability or an impairment, can be interpreted through either of those two lenses. What also happened was that I decided to go to university quite early on in my life. By the time I was 16, I was in the equivalent of my sixth form year, my start of my seventh form year. And I remember turning up to school and there was no teacher. I think it was meant to be a self-directed learning situation where there was screeds of writing on the blackboard, no teacher to be found. I couldn't see a single thing on the blackboard, couldn't read my books. And I just thought, how on earth am I going to get an education? And my best friend had decided to leave and go to Massey that year. And fortunately, my grades were okay. And I was able to also start at Massey University in what would have been my seventh form year. As I said, I was actually very young to be heading off to university, 16. But I think that was one of those sliding door moments. I think had I not gone to university at that point, I wonder sometimes what my life would have turned out like. Blind women are amongst the most unemployed and underemployed of any single group in our society. And that's not through a lack of ability. That is directly due to the inaccessible learning and employment environments that we continue to perpetuate. So luckily, I was able to go to university. Luckily, I had certain supports in place that meant I was able to thrive in that environment. But it was still a massive change for me. And whilst I managed to get through my study and graduate after 3 years, it was far from easy or straightforward. I decided to study English literature, which may have been an unusual choice given that actually I couldn't read books. But actually, as all of you will know, no matter which course you study through a tertiary education organisation, it involves reading to some degree, and in this case, to a large degree. But I don't full optimism, whatever it was, I knew, well, this was what I was interested in. I wanted to study what I was interested in. Actually, it's no more complex than that. But what I found was that it became very difficult very quickly. In those days, the Blind Foundation did not have the level of support in place to convert books into alternate formats. And you've got to remember, this is pre-computers in the way that we know today. I somehow got through my first year, and by my second year, I'd moved down to Wellington. So if it wasn't hard enough to be studying at the age of 16 at a university, partially blind, I decided to move cities as well. So there are some slight masochistic tendencies there. But what I had to do is my darling mother, who by this stage was a solo mum, raising her 4 children, working full-time as a nurse, she would come home and after her nursing shifts and read my novels, the books, the core texts onto audio cassette and post them to me down at Victoria. Just want you to think about that for a moment. That is an example of possibility. That was my mother recognizing that if she didn't fill that gap, I, through no fault of my own, would miss out on accessing a valuable education. So she spent hours and hours and hours narrating these books, these novels onto audio cassette so that I could participate, not on an even footing. It wasn't an even footing. It was far from it, but at least creating a step up and making it feasible, slightly possible, perhaps even slightly plausible that I could access a tertiary education and get my degree. And so there's something there about the willingness to think outside the square, to innovate. And when something really matters to us as a parent, as a society, as a tertiary organisation, what can we achieve? And I guess that's the point too, is if we do not value our access students as fully as other students, we will not go the extra distance. When we do, it's extraordinary what can actually be achieved. And so, but what I found is that as I went through my study, and I went on to do 2 degrees, I graduated at 19 with my degree from English literature, and went on later to AUT and studied a Bachelor of Communications. But again, one of the biggest challenges I came up against were the attitudes of some of my teachers and the organisations themselves. And this is not to throw people under the bus. It's just important that we, I think, are honest about the realities. And even though this is going back, it's not that far back. And I still remember one of my English lecturers, when I said I couldn't do sight reading, would sit in tutorials and we each had to read a passage. I actually love reading out loud. I'd done a lot of speech and drama, but I couldn't see the words. And every time it came to my turn, he would mock me and make a point of saying, oh, that's right, Minnie doesn't like to read out loud in front of people. incredibly damaging to a 17-year-old who's already going through so much. So I think his discomfort was projected onto me. And but regardless, somehow I got through. And similarly, when I was at AUT and was the first student to go through the Bachelor of Communication Studies, I was one of the top students. I had the marks to get into the television major. And I'm afraid the then head of TV simply would not let me onto the program. She could not understand how someone who was visually impaired, blind, could work in television. I would ask the question, who in that context is a little bit short-sighted? As it turned out, I majored in radio, was welcomed into the radio major, loved it. Since then, I have never once worked in radio, but I have worked in and out of TV for many, many years. So ultimately I got there, but not with the support of the very person who should have had the ability to think outside the square and to support me as a student. So anyway, as I said, I just wanted to paint a little bit of a picture around my story of learning. There's a lot more there. Next slide, thanks, guys. And so now what I'd like to do is just share with you a little bit more about this whole space of accessibility, share with you some of the work, the study, the thinking that I've done. Ultimately, it became very difficult for me to find work after I finished my education, even though I'd done fairly well. But the same barriers, the attitudinal barriers, the lack of possibility thinking, if you like, that pervaded the tertiary education space at the time, sadly also pervaded, and dare I say it, still pervades the space of employment. We still have so many blind spots when it comes to thinking about how we can employ people with diverse abilities in our workplaces. And I'll come to that shortly. But as I became more and more, as I went through my own education, was exposed to different worldviews, ways of thinking, and I'm so grateful for my study and the fact that I could get through, because without that, I don't think I would have learnt the frameworks, the ways of understanding society, the world around us, our writers, our thinkers, our creators, our history, our narratives as people. I'm so fortunate and so privileged to have had access to all of that richness. And I felt I had a huge obligation to use my education and the privilege that I had received to give back to society, I guess, if you like. And as I saw how inequitable my pathway in society was, when I compared my life trajectory to that of my peers who didn't have a sight impairment, my other peers who went through university, who are now jumping into these incredible jobs, and I was struggling to just access any job, I realised over time that I had a passion to work in social change and social justice. I'd also been brought up in a family where social justice was very important. I have a mother who has a deep sense of civil society and what it means to be part of a democracy. And if you see something that's wrong, you don't just sit back and grumble. You stand up, protest, get out there and do something about it. So it probably wasn't surprising that after many years of struggling to find employment, I ended up setting up my own social change organisation some years later with the support of the incredible Dame Tariana Turia back in the day, who was the Minister for Disability. And we ended up working extensively across New Zealand through a number of sectors, including the education sector. And we worked quite deeply with a number of universities and tertiary education organisations to support them on their accessibility journeys. So, but what I want to do now, and forgive me if you know all of this, it's always hard to know where people are at in their knowledge around a topic like accessibility, but I think it can't hurt to go over the fundamentals. So what are the facts? And we'll flick through these reasonably fast. You'll have access to these slides after, so don't worry if you don't capture them. So next slide, thanks. So The reality is that 1 in 4 of us live with an impairment. That is 25% of the population. That means, in theory, 25% of our student population, if we are directly reflecting the world around us, should have some kind of an impairment or access need. Next slide. We're talking about over 1 million New Zealanders living with a disability or impairment. This is not insignificant. In fact, I would argue this is one of the most significant groups in our society today. Yet how are we as tertiary education organisations actually truly thinking about and ensuring that our organisations have accessibility, or I would argue a possibility worldview, lens, mindset, not just functioning as a vertical program that we deliver against, but fundamentally woven through the DNA of every aspect of our organisation. And I suspect that, unfortunately, next slide, thanks, we are far from that place, despite, sorry, that was my mistake. Despite the incredible work that I know people like the Tertiary Education Commission and others have been doing for many, many years, I think we have a long way to go. And that's why I loved the proverb, the expression, in terms of where we are today. We've done some great work, but we can't rest on our laurels. We need to go much, much further, aim much higher, be much more ambitious. Otherwise, we will never create a truly equitable environment for those of us who live with an impairment or disability. When we think about this population on a global scale, we're actually thinking about close to 2 billion people worldwide. Next slide. This is enormous. This is, in fact, the largest untapped group in our society. If you want to think about it as a market, and of course, any of us coming through an economic lens or a business lens, and of course, education, rightly or wrongly, whatever our perspective is on that, is increasingly becoming associated with a business and has a financial reality tied into it. And so how are we thinking about attracting this incredibly huge, vast and growing population to attend and be part of our tertiary education environment? We're talking about the fact that 30% of millennials at least identify as having an impairment. So that's up on the 25% across mainstream society, 30%. And of course, we're seeing a lot of that through the areas of neurodiversity, and other lenses like that. Next slide, thanks. And of course, we're talking about the fact that by the time we're 65, 50% of us will have at least one impairment. By the time it's 2050, 30% of the population at least will identify as having an impairment. So in other words, as we age, the rates of impairment are increasing rapidly year on year on year. Next slide. So what I'm actually sharing with you here today is that whether it's through birth, accident, illness, or aging, next slide, all of us at some stage in our lives will experience disability, will live with an impairment. And the reality is, at some stage in our lives, the chances are it will be more than one impairment that we'll be experiencing and living with. Why this is significant is it changes the conversation. I think one of the old, outmoded ways we have of thinking about accessibility and innovation in education is we like to make this so neat and tidy. We like to say those disabled students or people with a disability sort of over there. It's very binary. Well, I think we all know we're no longer living in a binary world. Well, some of us still want to keep it in a binary world, but this is a world of nuance. We're on a continuum. And accessibility falls into that space as well. And I think it's time we updated how we think about access, to think about it in the sense that all of us at some stage in our lives will experience an impairment. And there is a very real chance that when we live with an impairment, we will be at some stage in our lives interacting with education and higher learning. We can no longer keep thinking about students with access needs as just being the student in the wheelchair, or the student who's blind, or the student who is deaf. We need to be expanding our lens and our way of thinking about who we're talking about. Next slide. And as I've touched on, there are very real economic imperatives for how we think about this space as well. What many of us don't know, next slide, is the idea of the access economy. And it's a way of looking at the world around us in terms of the spending power, the choices that people who live with an impairment make every day about where we study, where we get work, economic development, the products, the services that we purchase, and the way we interact with the world around us. And just as a very quick note, this space, this market, these 2 billion people worldwide and growing, is valued at US $13 trillion. This is the largest, probably one of the largest undertapped or untapped markets in the world today. Next slide. But the reality is, the world that we currently live in, the organisations that we work in, the society we've created, the educational environments, the employment environments, community at large, our legal environments, our policy environments, our administrative environments, our technology environments, had not been designed for this extraordinarily large and rapidly increasing number of people with this community at the heart of our design. This has resulted in a society where the status quo, the world as it is today, is deeply inaccessible. It is not a benign place. The world, the status quo, and as long as we keep perpetuating the status quo, as long as we do not design access in to every part of our work lives, of our community, of our society, it's not that it's a benign state. We're actually designing people out. So next slide, thanks. The status quo, I can't emphasize this enough, the status quo, which has come about through our dominant ways of thinking about people with disability and accessibility, that is currently woven through our DNA, does not work. It didn't work for me all those years ago. It doesn't work for millions, dare I say it, billions of people today. And it will not work for you and your families as you age, and as we increasingly encounter different impairments. The reality is, if we do not change our worldview, we are actually designing not just the 25% of people who live with an impairment out today, we are also designing our future selves out. As we age, as we gain impairments, we're designing our future selves out. Next slide. The reality is we need a new way of thinking about access. We need a new social contract. And I see tertiary education organisations as being the critical places who should, dare I say it, be leading in this space. And that is not what I'm currently seeing. I'd love to hear, and I know there's amazing work happening, so I don't want to sound too negative. I know there's amazing work happening, but I don't think we're going far enough. And yes, I've got the slide up there saying COVID. And the reason I've got that up there is, of course, we've all just been through the most massive disruption. And what I'd argue, next slide, is that we're now at a critical juncture. We're at a critical point in our human story. We're at a critical point, next slide, where we are in a world that many people describe as a VUCA world, a volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous world. Next slide. This is a world where all of us are experiencing massive disruption to the world around us, whether that's AI, whether this is pandemics, whether this is the aging population, the kind of incredibly distressing global unrest, political unrest that we're seeing around the world, the kinds of rising protectionism and leadership, the impact on the environment, climate change, all of these factors, and these are just a tiny handful. Many of you will be better equipped to identify the trends that are impacting us. Well, what concerns me and others is that these trends, and next slide, they don't happen one at a time. We don't have time one at a time to adapt to each one of these trends on their own. When we were experiencing COVID and the horrendous impact on all of us, but I would argue particularly on those communities such as Māori, Pacific and the disabled community, that's not all we were experiencing. On top of that, we're experiencing unprecedented flooding, climate change. Often these trends, these major impacts impact, sorry, my phone is talking to me very noisily in the background. We're experiencing multiple trends at the same time. And again, I come back to the extraordinarily difficult place that you as the tertiary education space are in right now. Next slide. So how are we thinking about accessibility in relation to this changing environment? How is our access community being served in a time in our social story when not only are we all grappling with how to move forward and the incredible uncertainty and chaos of the world around us, but how is a community such as the access community being factored in? Well, the thing is, we're not. And the risk is, as we see the rise of things like AI, chatbots and all the rest of it through the world of education, who's there on the front line thinking about how do we ensure that these things are being designed and utilised through our education and learning environments in a way that means people with access needs can not only thrive, but can thrive and also flourish. Because the risk right now is that if we do not understand how these major trends are impacting us, people with access needs will be designed further out. It's not about even maintaining the status quo of where we're at, which is already pretty poor. Things could actually go dramatically backwards for this community. So because of this time in COVID, I started to rethink the world of accessibility. And I started to think about the fact that we needed a new way and fresh lens of thinking about access. This also came after years and years and years of me working to advance a more accessible world, where I could see us making change and where I felt we were still struggling. It also came about after a very acute health experience I had when I went through a year of cancer myself and simply could not access the health system and the hospital environment in an equitable and fair way, which had pretty dire consequences on me and my life. Next slide, thanks. And as I lay there in my hospital bed over 12 months of ongoing treatment, it came to me that we needed a different way of thinking about accessibility that was fit for the 21st century. And this is where the idea of a possibility worldview or lens started to emerge. I realised that most of the world is stuck in what I call a disability worldview. It's down in that deficit place. Remember those teachers I mentioned at the beginning who could only think about the problem, who were only focused on minimum standards, who could not tune into a mindset of curiosity and wonderment, but could only focus on, who were largely coming, I think, from a place of fear and ignorance. And whilst I understand the place of fear and ignorance, when it comes to tertiary education, we cannot afford to be captured by fear and ignorance. This must be the space and the place where we pioneer bold and visionary ways of thinking and challenging the status quo. When I set up Be Accessible, my social change organisation, back in 2011, we started the conversation to move away from a disability narrative to an accessibility narrative. We started to challenge language, frameworks and ideas about the world around us. We started to talk about the fact that all of us will have an access need. We must stop just thinking about this in terms of an us and them kind of narrative. And we started to talk about investment rather than cost. It's so interesting to me when, as a society, if there's something we value, we talk about investment. When it's something we don't value, we define it as cost. Access and disability is almost always defined as a cost. But what we very rarely talk about is actually the cost of exclusion. We often talk about what it costs to create an equitable playing field. What we don't talk about is the cost of exclusion, which far outweighs the costs of inclusion. And what I realized, though, was that we needed a space and a place beyond accessibility, a place where we could innovate, reimagine, redesign, rethink, and be cognizant of this rapidly changing 21st century world we're living. This is not the 1960s or the 1970s or the 1980s or the 1990s. We're in the 2020s now. And the world, because of technology largely, is moving so rapidly. But how do we ensure that people with access needs, the pioneers, the leaders, the entrepreneurs, the designers and innovators with access needs are being supported to flourish through education and learning? And not only as learners, but as lecturers, as staff, as leaders within our tertiary organisation and institutions. Because what I've come to realise is that unless we support our access leaders, pioneers and visionaries, we will never create a truly accessible society. So at the heart, next slide, at the heart of this possibility worldview is the concept of what it means to be with our access community. Disability and accessibility worldviews are defined very much by doing to and for our access communities. Next slide. And what I'm passionately interested in through the possibility lens is the idea of with. It's also about being future focused. It's about systems change. It's about thinking about people, our students, our colleagues, our community as being multifaceted. We have to stop thinking about our access community as one-dimensional problems to be solved, but rather as multifaceted, interesting, curious humans, where we need to actually put time, energy, effort into reimagining how we design with, how we lead with, how we innovate with, how we educate with our access community in a way that is truly fit for the 21st century. How do we create a legacy that we can be proud of for the generations of access citizens who are yet to come, for our children, our grandchildren, and their children? So what is possibility? What does it look like? Next slide. So just very briefly, one of the best... Oh my goodness, I'm going on far too long. I'm so sorry. This is taking me longer. I'll try and speed up. So when I talk about possibility design and innovation, the best example I can think of is Arash. Arash is an amazing young man who was studying at Auckland University. He is from Iran. He has dyslexia. And while he was studying electrical engineering, he started to go deaf. He wondered how on earth he would access his education as a deaf student. He knows how difficult it is to get support for deaf students, especially at the level at which he was studying. He also at that stage didn't know sign language. He wasn't born deaf. And he thought, well, what is another way? What is a 21st century way I can access the world around me, my study, set up a business, fulfill his dreams and aspirations? And he decided to create the world's first, or one of the world's first, sign language avatars. So rather than deciding to use sign language interpreters, which are a very valid and an amazing solution, but they are what I would call a disability innovation, he decided to look at, well, combining the latest in technology, AI, his skills as an innovator and designer, to completely reimagine and rethink what was possible in the area of accessibility for the 21st century. Today, his avatar and his company has investment and is being sought after across the world. His avatar has the potential to totally transform the lives of deaf people all around the world. Instead of having to wait to access funding support, get sign-off and approval for sign language interpreters through lecturing, through study, through employment, just imagine being able to have access to a sign language avatar at all times on your phone. This is possibility. This is the space and the area that we need to be thinking about as tertiary education providers. And how do we, what role can we be playing, next slide, in supporting this kind of innovation? Next slide, thanks. How can we be supporting research and development in this space? Next slide, I'll just get us to jump ahead. And next slide. Sorry, I've taken far too long. Possibility is more than inclusion. Possibility is the future of design. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, we'll just hold it there for now.
Minnie.
Yes.
Sorry, it's Sarah. Look, we can run over. That's no problem at all. And for people who might have to leave us at 12, Minnie's presentation and everything will be available afterwards for you to look at. So let's not. We've had such a great conversation. It's so good having you walk us through this. So let's not panic about that.
Okay.
So Jordan and I are just going to swap functionality for a minute. So Jordan is just going to stop sharing her screen for a moment and I will start sharing your presentation. So if everyone will just bear with us for a moment while we sort that out at our end. Stand by, team.
And I'll just be I'll try and keep it shorter. We're
yeah,
only
no,
a couple
look,
more
honestly,
minutes.
it's no
Drama.
issue. I'm sure people will stay with us where they can
Okay.
and where they can't. I'll just see now. How's that looking, everyone? Is that what we're expecting? Nearly. Sorry about this, everyone. Just bear with us a moment. Oh, okay. Now that you're all going to suddenly get stars in front of your eyes, as many experiences with us flicking through. Right, we've gone back through to withholding, Minnie.
Okay, so perhaps next slide.
Next slide, yep.
And the next one.
Possibility is the future of design.
Next one, thanks.
Next one, yeah.
Great. Okay. And so, sorry, yes, I have probably jumped through some of those a little bit quicker, but never mind. So the question really is, where do you think you're at? Where is your organisation at? And I realised that what I've got up here is D or A or P, which I think is actually like the acronym for your disability action plans, but that's just a coincidence. So what that actually stands for in this occasion is, are you at disability, are you at accessibility, or are you operating from a place of possibility? Well, I can probably fairly confidently say that it's unlikely any of you are firmly in the possibility space. But there may be projects, there may be parts of the work that's happening within your organisation that fit within that sphere. I would argue most would be somewhere down at between the disability and the accessibility end of the spectrum. But the reason why the spectrum is so useful as a tool is that without it, I don't think we realise that there is a space beyond. I think if we don't understand that there is this way of operating, there is this way of seeing the world called possibility, we can be captured by a disability, by the dominant disability/accessibility narrative that is prevalent throughout our society. And so prevalent, in fact, we don't even question it most of the time. So as I said from the very beginning, what I'm hoping at the very least, you come away realizing that these are worldviews. There are so many different ways of looking at the world of accessibility and people who live with an impairment. There are so many different ways of thinking about our role and how we can show up as tertiary education organisations. And I guess the point that I would labour and emphasise is we have a responsibility, I believe, to be the pioneers, the anchors in society of thinking, of leadership, of thought leadership, and of then providing spaces and places where everybody should and can have access to thinking and ways of being in the world that ensure our society keeps moving forward in the most fair and equitable way. So next slide. And one of the quickest ways to know where you're at as an organisation, I think, is to simply look at your diversity plans. And I could probably put money on the fact that no matter which organisation you're in, accessibility and disability is the last item to show up on your diversity plan. I would love to see an organisation that puts accessibility at the front end. Just imagine how that would transform our experience of the world. But anyway, that's a much bigger conversation. So my possibility challenge to you today is to think about flipping your diversity plan. What would that result in? Next slide. But I want to just give you a couple of quick examples, next slide, of when I worked very closely with AUT University. Now, unfortunately, and this is not a criticism of AUT, it's more a reflection of the changing nature and this VUCA world that we're all having to manage in at the moment. But AUT, and certainly under the leadership of Derek McCormack, was an extraordinary accessibility champion. I would say they were one of the leading organisations in this space for many, many years. And in fact, Derek came on as one of our top possibility champions when I was running Be Accessible. When we went to set up what after running the Be Accessible, I set up an organisation called the Global Centre of Possibility. And that's because I realised we needed to create a space and a place somewhere in Aotearoa which was totally focused on innovation, research and development, thought leadership for the 21st century and accessibility. And AUT put its hand up to host, support, nourish and invest in that space. That to me is the most powerful indication of a tertiary education organisation working in possibility. And not only did they support the establishment of the Global Centre of Possibility, a place where we could hothouse burgeoning and budding access entrepreneurs, designers and innovators. They also supported the design and creation of a possibility index. Now this index is still under development, but we're hoping will be piloted in the next 12 months. And it is an index to measure the state of accessibility and the experience of accessibility in our world today, but not just focusing on what is accessible, but starting to look at how do we measure environments of possibility. These are the kinds of tools, resources, innovations. When I think about that incredible innovation that Arash and Kara Technologies made around his sign language avatar, not only is that an incredible innovation to come out of another tertiary organisation, but it is actually an innovation that could transform the experience of students and of staff learning and working within our tertiary sector. What I think we need is to have an event, a conference, something, a series of learning experiences where we come together as a learning community to reimagine, A, what is needed to move us into a space of possibility, B, to surface the innovations that are already available that we may not know of, that we could be harnessing and using in our tertiary environment, and then to start telling the stories about tertiary environments as centres of possibility. I've just, as of last year, I moved from Auckland to live in Wanganui, and my hope actually is that Wanganui will become the first city of possibility in the world. I want Wanganui to become a place where we can pilot innovation. And one of my proposals is that, and I'm being very bold here, is that UCOL here could become a centre of possibility design and innovation. It doesn't need to be the only centre, but we do need a space and a place that is dedicated to this work. Unfortunately, with the change of leadership and all the changes that have gone on over the last few years, we no longer have the same amazing partnership with AUT, but we're open to creating a new partnership, and this time it might be with the UCOL in Wanganui. But as I said, this is a partnership, this is a way of thinking that we want everyone to embrace. Next slide. Next slide. So this is really about us being curious. This is about us asking, where do we want to be? Next slide. What future do we choose? Because as I said, the status quo is not benign. The status quo is deeply inaccessible. As long as we continue to do nothing, or we continue to do the things we've always done, we will continue to design the 25% of us who live with an impairment out of the world around us. And as I said, ultimately, it's not just the 25%, it's all of us throughout our lifetime. So which future do you choose? Next slide. Which reality do you want for your tertiary education? Do you choose to be with or not to be with? A possibility mindset. The choice is entirely ours. Next slide. Otherwise, we're choosing to design our future selves out. Next slide. Well, from my perspective, this choice is so blindingly obvious. It's so clear, it's so apparent, and I hope that you have a sense of that after today's presentation. I'm so sorry that I went over time. This is such a big topic. Next slide. If you want to learn more about possibility thinking, this is a small little plug for my book called Blindingly Obvious. And this book, because I had to model the way, is aiming to be the most accessible book. It is the first book to be made available fully, the first non-fiction book in Aotearoa to be available in New Zealand Sign Language. It's available in audio. It's soon to be converted into Braille. It's available as a podcast in all sorts of different formats. But if you want to go more deeply into my possibility thinking, why possibility matters, experience of learning, there's a lot more you can unpack through that, and you can find that through my website. Next slide. I realise that's a huge amount to have covered, and again, I'm sorry for having taken so long to go through it all. I am available if you want to continue the conversation at some later stage. And all I can say is please keep curious in this space. If I had not had the access to the education that I had, I very much doubt I would be doing this work. I very much doubt I would have set up the organisations I've set up and being able to have this conversation with you here today. Tertiary education, the work you all do, is pivotal in changing people's lives. And so I hope you choose a future of possibility. Thank you.